Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And since this is likely our last hearing of the year, I want to say to Chairman Johnson and to Ranking Member Crapo, thank you for the very engaged, very open way that you have run this committee and given us an opportunity to explore so many issues. It's really been terrific. And I also want to say on Chairman Johnson's retirement that your leadership has always been knowledgeable, thoughtful, principled, and it has been a great honor to serve with you, sir. So thank you. I want to talk about safety and soundness. In January 2011, Federal Reserve Governor Tarullo gave a speech on regulating systemic risk in our financial institutions and how problems in one financial firm can create risks for overall financial stability. And I was thinking about an example. Two banks, JP Morgan and New York Mellon, settle all tri-party repurchase agreements in the market. $1.6 trillion worth of securities are funded by tri-party repos every day. If a cyber attack disrupted the ability of either of those banks to allocate collateral, it could have devastating consequences for securities firms, for money market mutual funds, major banks, even the liquidity of the United States Treasury. Now, Ms. Abend, this strikes me as a classic safety and soundness issue. The OCC safety and soundness analysis requires you to investigate how sensitive banks are to systemic market risk and how exposed each individual institution is to market risk given particular products and services that it offers. Then OCC regulators give the institution a ranking signifying whether it has adequately addressed each of the risks that are identified. So I want to know whether systemic risk from cybersecurity is taken into account in the ranking, and second, whether firms that are not prepared are determined, as determined by the OCC, to have failed to satisfy the safety and soundness guidelines are then treated.
So cybersecurity has been a top priority for the OCC, particularly over the last couple of years.
No, I appreciate that. You've made that clear.
And in that process, we do look at the risk profile of our institutions. As part of the cybersecurity risk assessment, we actually looked at various aspects of their cybersecurity inherent risk profile, which includes technologies that they use, the products and services that they offer, and the connections that they have. And as part of our OCC examination process, we do assign some of our most talented IT examiners to be resident on site at our largest institutions.
No, I understand that, but the question I was asking is whether or not you take this into account in ranking the institutions and then holding them accountable as part of your safety and soundness analysis.
We do see cybersecurity as a safety and soundness issue, and we do look at the risk profile of those institutions. And
you put it into the ranking?
And I'm not actually the expert who conducts that part of the ranking policy. But what I can say is that we do have a risk-based analysis as to how we determine the risks of our institutions and the level of resources that they get on site as resident exams.
Well, as we all know here, a future cyber attack could paralyze the financial sector with devastating consequences for our economy. No two crises are alike. We want to be out in front on this, and I'd really like to know that the OCC is using this as part of their ranking. Let me ask about another issue. When we talk about cyber attacks that affect our financial institutions, we should remember it's not just the institutions themselves who are at risk. There's a whole chain of organizations. We've talked a little bit about this. There are lots of individuals, institutions that present vulnerabilities, from the merchants to the acquirers to the payments processors and even to the employees. Forbes reported yesterday that 71% of employees in a new survey report having access to data they should not see. But my point is that each and every one of these links in the chain of commerce means millions of people potentially are exposed to financial fraud and theft. Last year's breach at Target, which we've talked about a little bit today, made this abundantly clear. We now know that criminals used one of Target's vendors to breach Target's system by using malware to capture credit card and debit card information. In this case, there was a single point of failure. One vendor who had computers that were authorized to submit billing information to Target that created a breach that affected the entire chain. So, Mr. Peretti, how is Treasury monitoring the other entities along the chain, from the retail merchants to the third-party data processors and software providers, all the way down the line before it gets to the banks, to ensure that they are making the necessary investments in cybersecurity?
So what Treasury's been doing is been communicating with financial firms to be able to highlight this risk within the system, to be able to make sure that they're paying attention not only to their own internal systems, but also all their vendors. One of the ways we've been doing that is to really publicize the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a framework to be able to first be able to identify how you're doing cybersecurity within your own organization, but then we've been asking firms to be able to use this potentially as a way to be able to look at their outside vendors.
So, I'm sorry, so your monitoring of the chain is limited to telling the financial institutions to take a look at the chain? Is that what you're saying?
So the financial firms are based upon a risk model in which they look at that. They are able to select their vendors based upon the products and services that they need to be able to deliver the services to their customers.
I think that meant yes. Is that what you were saying?
What we try to do is deliver the information to them so that they can make appropriate risk management determinations as opposed to telling them which vendors they should or should not use.
Well, I'm not talking about telling them which vendors to use. What I'm just trying to understand is the process by which you're monitoring. The risk comes in all the way up and down the chain, and we obviously know that now. So the question I was asking about is whether you have any direct monitoring of any part of the chain, and what I think I'm hearing you say is you're just telling the financial institutions to be sure to monitor.
So Treasury is not a financial regulator.
I understand
we
that.
We have 17 federal and state financial regulators out there. What we do is provide information to them so that as they do their examination process, that could be incorporated into their examination procedures going forward. So we do not go out and monitor or survey any of those folks. That's not our role within the sector. We provide that information to the regulators to be able to then use that information within their examination process.
I'm over my time, but if I can ask just one more question, just a little bit here. Dr. Schneck, how much risk do retailers pose, and particularly small retailers, particularly those who don't have the resources for sophisticated cyber defense?
So thank you. That's a great point, and I would ask to expand it to the small to medium business. In
Fair
general.
enough. Yes.
So we think that's a
Expand.
lot of risk, and that's part of why, as Mr. Peretti was mentioning, we do leverage this cybersecurity framework because it was developed by industry and government, by scientists from industry with NIST and with DHS, and we use those best practices to bring the discussion of cybersecurity as a risk equation. Because most small to medium businesses, at least last year with whom I've spoken, didn't really look at cybersecurity as a main part of their risk equation. And we're trying very hard to change that with these massive outreach programs. I've actually gone out west and talked to venture capitalists who start the smallest companies with the best technologies and ask them how they could invest tens of millions of dollars in intellectual property and not think about how to protect it. So we are trying to change the paradigm of how we focus on cybersecurity and make it part of how every entity in that chain looks at their risk so that the information that Mr. Peretti gets is more accurate. And we're using these outreach programs as a way to do that. And we are trying to incentivize using cybersecurity with tools such as developing a market for cyber insurance and working closely with Treasury on that. Other areas look at grants or how do we protect reputation forward. But really making security part of the culture, making it good to share information about a breach because your experience is very common and can protect a lot of others. And that's the kind of intelligence and galvanization that we as a country and community need to do to help government and industry tackle this and change the profit model for the criminals.
Well, good. Well, I very much appreciate that you are trying to shift the paradigm here. I understand the focus on the banks and why that's so important. But we've got to harden our security up and down the line, and I think that we can't just make this about the banks. It's got to be the whole chain here. So thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.